I am a regular member here. I even wear my membership badge. I was in Washington a few days ago, and while I was there was a very interesting meeting that was taking place in Washington, and I wasn't a part of it. It was the 28th International Congress on Alcohol and Alcoholism. And they had some, as they headlined it in the newspaper, some new insights into alcoholism that I thought that you might be somewhat interested in. And in this article, they reported that the tight little world of people who deal with the problems of alcoholism is undergoing profound change. Old assumptions dating from the time when church-oriented groups dominated the field are being overthrown in favor of ideas developed from modern scientific research, whatever that is. And they said that they're challenging what have been complete assumptions, said Dr. Selden D. Bacon, director of the Center for Alcohol Studies at New Jersey's Rutgers University. Among the assumptions being challenged is one that has become a tenet in the fight against alcoholism, Dr. Bacon said, and that is that alcoholism is a disease. Dr. Morris Chaffetz, a psychiatrist who is director of the alcoholic clinic at Massachusetts General Hospital, called the disease concept a backward step taken by the American Medical Association to allay the guilt of doctors who have refused to treat alcoholics. Alcoholism is no more of a disease than a headache is, Dr. Chaffetz asserted. And I could assert from what Dr. Chaffetz said that he's not an alcoholic. He can't tell the difference between what we went through and a headache. No one is sure where this new research will take the treatment of alcoholism, Dr. Chaffetz said. And I agree with that. We can't be sure where that's going to take us. But then he goes on to say that we now need basic research into what alcoholism is. We don't know what it is, he says. So it's not a disease according to the consensus of the 28th International Congress on Alcohol and Alcoholism. But Dr. Chaffetz goes on to say another very important thing, and that is that he believes that more work is needed in the early identification of alcoholics to catch them before they stop drinking. Now that is the smartest thing that he said, because if they take a drink, then it's too late to catch them, I'll guarantee you. If you're going to catch one, you better do it before he starts. Well, I'm here to tell you that my name is Jack Boland, and I am an alcoholic, and I really do believe, I am convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt, that alcoholism does exist and that it is a disease. And the first giant step forward that I ever made in my life was when I realized this and accepted this concept and admitted that I was an alcoholic. And the reason, I was sort of kidding about what Dr. Chaffetz said, except that more and more in some of the medical literature and in their research, we're hearing more and more about this concept that alcoholism is not a disease, particularly in the fields of psychology and psychiatry. And back on the East Coast, we're hearing a lot of it. And some of the people who are actively involved in treating alcoholics are coming up with this. And I don't know exactly where that will lead, except I really don't believe that it will lead into helping, in any large measure, alcoholics to recover. Now, this happens to be my opinion, because in my own mind and in my own world, one of the great comforts that I have, one of the things that sets my mind at ease and gives me a peace that I would not have, is to remember that this is a disease and that I have it. But more than that, that there really is an answer to it. You know, it's only a tragedy and it's only a problem It would only be if there was no real answer. But we do have the answer. We are a part of the answer. And this is where our identification is. It certainly is where I attempt to place my identification as an alcoholic within the answer that we call the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, within the framework of this great organization and many other things that help and support us in this way of life, which says, first of all, that it is a disease from which no alcoholic has ever recovered. I am recovering from a disease that I will never recover from. That probably no human help can be the answer to my problem, but that God would, if sought. And this I have come to believe, and what I'd like to talk to you about tonight is not so much what happened to me. I'll try to throw in some little things that will help to convince you, if you're not already convinced, that I do have this problem. But I'd like to talk more about the answer than I would about all of the involvement, all of where I drank and who I drank with. So, incidentally, before I get into that, on the next page of that same newspaper that I just quoted you from, there was an article that Charles Jackson, 66, author of The Lost Weekend, died Saturday, the day before, in St. Vincent's Hospital. And his death was ruled a suicide, and that he died of acute barbiturate poisoning. And I happened to, just a short time before that, have talked to a member of Alcoholics Anonymous who knew this man quite intimately and said that he had apparently been unable to find his answer in this program of Alcoholics Anonymous, which once again reminds me of how fortunate I am, how blessed I am, and how grateful I am that and that looking out upon you, that we really are part of something that is truly great, that supplies for us a source of strength and understanding, of comfort, of release, of help, and of hope that just isn't available from any or from all of the other sources. A source of understanding. What I've heard in these meetings and what I've read in the literature and in the book Alcoholics Anonymous describes me to me. And that's what I was looking for in some measure all of my life. I was looking for something that would describe me to me. And I never heard me described until I started talking to a couple of alcoholics, and then some more, and then most particularly until I picked up the book Alcoholics Anonymous, and there I saw me. And there I began. That was the beginning of a process of discovering who and what I am. And that process started on July the 10th, 1953. And because this program does work, because there is a God who loves us all, who expresses himself through this fellowship, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink or a pill since that date. And I try to stop sometime during the course of each day and remember this and to be grateful for it, because this is truly a miracle. This is a gift, and it comes from a giver to a recipient. And I can remember how it was before I received this gift. I can remember some of the things that happened in the process and that continue to happen. And I'm truly delighted with how it is now. Now, I don't want it to remain the way it is now any more than you do. And that's why we're here, I think, this weekend, is so that however it is now in your life and mine, it doesn't have to remain that way. You see, one of the great joys of this way of life is that the door is always open to some larger understanding and some larger horizon. In reading this article, and I didn't read all of it to you that I read, so many people imply or think or relate the disease of alcoholism to the process of drinking or to the consumption of alcohol. In other words, it would be almost the same as saying that drinking is alcoholism. That drinking is the disease. And I would have to agree with Dr. Shavitz that no, that drinking is not the disease of alcoholism. Drinking is one of the symptoms of the disease. And I didn't know that until I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't even know that drinking was a problem. And certainly I didn't know that, I just didn't know what it was. But I've talked to and listened to so many people, and in the beginning I thought that drinking was the disease, that when we referred to alcoholism, that was referring to my obsession to drink and to the fact that once I took a drink, that I was an alcoholic, that my disease more or less began when I drank and ended when I stopped drinking, and that during those periods when I was drinking, I was experiencing alcoholism, and that somehow or another, in those periods when I was not drinking, I was relieved from my alcoholism, and that the answer was therefore to not drink, and that not drinking would not be the answer. And I can't quite remember whether those first few members of AA that talked to me told me this directly or not. But if they did, they just flat lied, because, if they implied to me, or whether I just came up with the idea that if I stopped drinking, that in that stopping drinking I would find the answer. It only took me a short time to begin to experience that. That was the opportunity for the answer, but man, that wasn't the answer, because the thing that made me want to drink was being sober, being dry. What they said was going to be the answer, man, that'd been the problem I'd had all my life. That was why I drank. One of the things that I've never been able to understand, now I know there are periodic alcoholics, and some of you are periodic, and I'm sure you probably don't understand, how I did it any more than I understand how you did it. But staying dry, I would stand it, I would put up with it just about as long as I could, until I just thought I was going to lose my mind if I didn't finally get back to taking just one little one. Not a big one, not several, but just one little one, because then it would relieve me of the way I felt when I wasn't drinking. And you know what I'm talking about. And the only point that I'm trying to make here is that I came to believe that alcoholism is a disease, that drinking is one of the symptoms. I grant you one of the major symptoms. That's one symptom that all of us had in common. He didn't catch us before we started, did he? And without having had that first drink and the ones that followed it, I'm sure that many of the things that happened to me could not or would not have happened to me. There's a certain part of the insanity, of the real insanity, of the weird way of life that I came to experience that could not have happened had I not consumed alcohol. But alcohol did not make me what I was. And I read in the book I was reading tonight, just before I came over here, something that, I don't know whether I can put my finger on it at this moment or not. But once in AA, and once we have set the drinking problem aside, then the process is to begin to discover what our problem was before I became obsessed with the drinking. And how now I can look back and see that how true this was in my life. How disturbed I was how hungry for real answers I was all my life. How that the environment in which I was born, in which raised me, in which taught me, seemed to teach me all the wrong things. Or maybe from it I just learned all of the wrong things. I learned how to be afraid and how to know hopelessness. Long before I took my first drink, I had come to accept the fact that there was no real hope for me. Now, not in words. I never said this out loud. But I had already given up on those early dreams that I had, and I think that perhaps all of us had. So that by the time I took my first drink, not knowing really what was going to happen when I took it, the thing that made it so attractive was that suddenly it seemed to restore the hope that I had already lost, but did not know that I had lost. It seemed to restore an adequacy that I did not know was missing, a sense of belonging to something when I really had never admitted that I always felt alone and unidentified and separate and apart from. I never had really belonged. As a matter of fact, I had such a little family and was so disillusioned with what I had. I never felt a part of my family. I never felt as though that I belonged in school. There was no place that I really did belong, or that I really believed that I did. I looked ahead in my thought and hoped for a time or for an experience. But I took a drink, and suddenly that was the experience. It was there. And the world of unreality for me became reality. And from that moment on, I more and more was unable to determine what was real and what was unreal, what was right and what was not right, and what was wrong. And things began to run together in my consciousness and in my mind. That was the beginning of the gradual descent into a way of thinking, a way of resenting, a way of hating, a way of running, a way of fearing, a way of awakening morning after morning, year after year in my life, and being so ashamed, so remorseful for what had happened, not always knowing what had happened, but feeling that remorse anyhow, and knowing full well that this was another day that was going to be like those other days, and being unable to face the experiences that lay about me in my life. What I'm saying is that my life and that what I was, never did suit me, except when I drank in those early years. And then it only suited me because I imagined. I lived in the world of the imagination. I drank because I wanted something to happen and took a drink, and sure enough, there was an instant happening for me. I didn't have to go across town to get it. That was where the action was. And all of you alcoholics know exactly what I was talking about, and I don't want to become involved in all of that, because in 12 years, it's really a very short time. Tommy will have his 11th birthday next week, and he was just saying what a short time that is. These years of sobriety really do seem so short as compared to those years of drinking, because that was my experience. It seemed like forever. It seemed like a lifetime. It seemed unending. A day was an unending experience. A night. Do you remember those nights? Those nights when you couldn't sleep? How long they were? Do you remember some of those experiences and some of those arguments and fights that looked like they never would end, that lasted all month or seemed like all year? Of course you do. Now these days are like today. It's been so sweet and so short. You know, it's so beautiful and so good. And that's because that we're a part of the answer now. The first step of Alcoholics Anonymous, the one that says we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable, happened to me one day. And I think that day was in April in 1953. And I say it happened to me. I did not know that it existed anywhere or that there were 11 more that followed. But on that day, I had just returned from seeing a sheriff of another county, and he had suggested by a long-distance telephone that if I didn't come up, he was going to come down. And I had just had another talk with the sheriff of that county a day or two before. There were 2 banks, an assorted number of small loan companies, a savings and loan company, numerous clothing stores, doctors, an attorney or 2, and various other and assorted long list of people who were trying to get in touch with me, but the sheriff was the one that did. And I went up to see him, and we had a little visit about the problem of that automobile burning up. And he wanted to know where I was when it caught fire. And the insurance adjusters wanted to know where I was. And he asked me where I was, and then a few minutes later he asked me again. And I think he asked me 3 or 4 times before I got out of there, and I told him where I was, where I thought I was. I really didn't know where I was. And it seemed like that I had money borrowed on that automobile from 2 different banks, and quite a bit more than it was worth. And it was just one of the little problems, and I got back to Roanoke that day, spent my last $2 to go over to see my children. You've heard me say how that I took a couple of drinks and called over to, that they were staying with their mother at my brother-in-law. And I announced that I was coming, and then there was a pause, and she said, well, I'll ask Hyatt if it will be all right. And she turned apparently to ask Hyatt, and another pause, and he said, yes, if he doesn't stay too long. So I spent my last $2 on cab fare and went over. And this was when the first step happened to me. I walked in, and the last human being on earth that understood me, I thought, a very dear young lady, saw me enter, and without saying a word, she stood up and looked straight at me for a moment and turned and walked out another door. And I saw myself. And that first step happened to me. It happened within me. Something started taking place in my mind, and I saw what I was. I was uncovered. I was naked before myself. I didn't want this to happen. I saw what I had been doing. I saw that any words that I use will be inaccurate, and you'll just have to get the feeling, because I didn't see this in words. I saw what a phony, what a liar I had been. I saw how I had blamed everybody for everything all my life, and had never one time put the burden of responsibility on myself. I saw this far better than words will describe it. I saw it, and I knew the truth of it. I knew how sorry I was. Not how sick I was, but how sorry. That was the way I saw it. And I couldn't stand it. And I sat down there in a chair, and I cried. And in a few minutes, I looked up, and my then wife was there. And I said, I can't go on like this. There must be something wrong with me. And that was the understatement of my life until that moment there. But I saw it, and it was really the first time. Now, this had been trying to happen to me from time to time over the years. I can remember other times when it almost happened, but I wouldn't let it. You know what I mean. I kept it from happening. But this time I could not keep it from happening. And suddenly I was willing to stop lying. I don't mean that I did stop, but I became willing to stop lying. I knew that I was not only powerless over alcohol, I knew that I couldn't drink successfully. I knew that I was a drunk. I had never applied that terminology to me. I knew that I could not drink successfully, but I knew that I could not stop. And you know, it's an amazing thing how much you can know in just a few seconds or just a few minutes. How much you can see and know. I knew not only did I know this, but I knew that my life was unmanageable, aside from drinking. I knew that I was powerless over life. I knew that I was helpless. But I didn't know that there was any help at that moment. Now, it's a terrible thing to be helpless, but to be outside any source of help and to not know there is any help from God or man. I didn't believe in God and didn't believe in man. And at that moment, I did not believe in myself. But that was the happening of the first step in my life. And it was a dramatic, shocking, awakening experience wherein that if someone had walked in at that moment from Alcoholics Anonymous and said, I want to talk to you, and started speaking, I believed that that moment of truth, that my mind was receptive to what we would tell another alcoholic. I believe this. Only a very short time after that, through a strange set of coincidences that I won't go into, but believe me, they were strange, I found myself in Alcoholics Anonymous. Not relating the happening of this first step at that time. It was quite some weeks after that when I began to look back. You know, it's so much easier to see the course of this journey that we have taken in retrospect, isn't it? It's so much easier to see that how all of these things have been shaping up. The answer has been trying to happen to us long before we would let it happen. It certainly was in my case. And then when there is that breakdown of the ego, of the will, and it does begin to happen, one thing leads to something else, and then old Joe is standing at the right place at the right time, or the telephone rings, or look at your own experience, and something leads to something which leads to the answer. And this is the way it was in my life, but I couldn't see it at the moment. All I could see was my suffering and my hopelessness. I had long since gotten below the point of being able to work. I was living in that one small room and sitting in the park and bumming drinks. That's how powerless I was. And yet I had been just that powerless, but had been unable to see it a short time before. Being powerless doesn't mean that we always accept it or see it, even today. You know, even in the light of this truth. But as a result of that acceptance, of that first step, without knowing it, without being conscious of it, I was ready, I now believe, for something else to happen, and it did. I was ready to be placed in the presence of someone who could tell me. And I was, just like you were. I found myself talking to some people who started telling me about myself. And I could hear it. Before I experienced that first step, I guarantee you I wouldn't have heard it. I just wouldn't have stood around long enough to have heard it. But I started hearing about me. And that first night that I listened to 2 AA members speak to me, I started to believe in a power that was greater than myself that could restore me to sanity, or that could restore order in my life, or that could eliminate the confusion. Now, the second step started happening to me before I even knew there was a first or a second one. It happened when 2 AA members walked in and started telling me that it didn't have to be like this. They didn't tell me about God or talk about a power. They said, you don't have to take a drink today, and I didn't know that. Obviously I hadn't known it. I thought I had to. I'd spent all those years thinking that I had to, and educating myself that I had to, and telling my friends that not only that I had to, but that they should too. Because we do like company. You know, drunk or sober, we like company, don't we? And I like that company. And these fellows walked over and started telling me that I didn't have to be this way. And this was the beginning of the second step. Now later on I had to begin to clarify it in my own mind. I had and I did sometime later come to believe in a specific power. And at first the power to me was the group, the sobriety of the group, the combination of personalities that were there that I could lean on and see and trust and believe in. And this was the power, and I chose to not believe in God, and so stated. My understanding of God was that there wasn't one. And I wasn't at all bashful about saying it. And I was a very generous soul in those days, generous enough to let you believe it if you wanted to. I just happened to know better. Well, I happened to go out and get drunk again about 3 weeks later. And I didn't believe I was ever going to get drunk again, because I knew that I was an alcoholic. And I knew that what I knew I really did know. And I knew that being an alcoholic and knowing what had happened to me, I was not going out and let this thing happen. And I told them that I was not. And they said, that's not the way we work this program. And I said, that's all right. That's the way I work it. And I did for 3 whole weeks. And I don't remember taking the first drink, but I sure do remember some of the things that happened on that drunk. And the sense of separation. The prodigal son living in a far country was never more separated than I. I was that prodigal son who had used this gift. I had taken my heritage, this answer, and I had taken it out and I had used it erroneously. And I found myself outside and I could not get back. And if there's anybody here who has ever been outside as a result of being drunk and cannot get back, you'll know how frightening this is. This is hell. If you want to know where hell is, I'll tell you where it is. To want to be back and to want to not take another drink and to want to be able to remember the thought that was so important to me last week. To remember the things that I heard and that I said, and to be absolutely and completely separated from them. Not only from God and man, but from my own inner self. And that's hell, and that's where I was. And I wanted back, and I could not get back. And I desperately tried. And I tried to not drink. I tried to get sober with everything that was in me for several weeks. And I even called and asked for help. And the people that I called had already given up on me and would not come. And I sat one hot July day, all morning and all afternoon in the hot sun with a fifth of vodka, waiting for an AA member to come and talk to me. And I was afraid to go back to the telephone because I was afraid I would miss him. You know, I was afraid that he would come and I would not be there. And finally, in desperation, I made another call. And he said he'd be there in a few minutes. He'd been detained and he never did come. And this was very good for me because later on it made me know that when someone needs help, take him at his word. He might really mean it. I can find out after I get there whether he does or not. But I wanted back in, and one day I was able, not through prayer because I didn't know about it, but through just desperation, I found myself back in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I thought I might be one of the hopeless ones. I believed that I was. I knew that I had my last chance because I could remember distinctly that the feeling, the experience that I had had, this wasn't a bad habit with me, my friends. This wasn't something that I could pick up or put down at will, at choice. This was something that once I picked it up, I had lost the power to put it down for all time. And once I took a drink, I was outside of what was important to me and did not have the power to get back in. So do you see how that when I tell you that this first step, the admission of powerless, it was not just some intellectual concept, but it was a total experience in my life. And it was so necessary because I was always so hard-headed. I had to be shown things the hard way. And I'll guarantee that this universe is so designed that if you and I want it the hard way, then we're going to get it. Don't question that. God arranged an order of things so that we'll get it the way we want it. We can take this way out. If we want to complicate it, that's the easiest thing on earth to do, and I know because I did it. But to uncomplicate it, to wind that string back up and find my way back in. But one day I did, and I was exquisitely grateful just to be back in and be able to go to a meeting and not take a drink and to not know whether I'd be able to stay sober a day. I didn't have the assurance or the faith or even the hope that I could. That's how desperate I was. Now, where I was in my experience, with $10,000 in debt and no job and no profession, and the inadequacy that prevented me from accepting employment at some high level that would get me out of debt right away. And all of those people out there waiting for me. And that family situation, which was hell. Living in the worst room, in the worst house, on the worst street, in the worst part of town. 2 years before, as you've heard me say, I lied about being there. I was too good to be in that part of town. Truth. I told a flat-out lie to my next-door neighbor. But no, he hadn't seen me there. 2 years later, I lived there. And not by choice. Now, I want you to know, if I haven't implied it so far, that all of this that was happening to me was against my will. I didn't set out. I guarantee you I didn't set out to suffer in the manner that I did. And what happened to me, in spite of what Dr. Chaffetz said, was more than a headache. It was a way of life. It was an experience, and it was a total involvement with insanity and disorder and confusion and chaos. And I was dry in AA then for a short period of time. And the chaos did not go away. And everything that was a responsibility to me was as difficult to face as responsibility had been for me all of my life. Now maybe you stopped drinking and threw your chest out and your shoulders back and stood up tall and straight and said, tomorrow I am going out and face my responsibilities. That ain't the way it happened in my case. Because I stood up and shuddered and was very much afraid at what I was going to have to face. And my mind would actually go blank when I would just look in the direction of what I was going to have to do to face my situation. And I had to go get a job, and I did. And I had to talk to customers, and I did. But each experience was frightening. And this went on. And not only this, but within my mind, I was as powerless over negative emotions as I had been when I drank. Now, in that short period of time that I'd been in AA before I got drunk, one old-timer who had been sober about 6 months came up to me. Well, he didn't come up to me. I was riding in his car over to a poker game after a meeting one night. And I was just giving somebody hell. But that was not unnatural for me because I did that regularly. And this man, who could get away with it because he was an invalid, he had one leg that was shriveled and he was very small, turned and said some things to me that I would have just clobbered him for if he had been just about half my size and half well. And it had to do with my resentments. He said, "You're the most resentful person that I've ever seen since I've been sober in Alcoholics Anonymous." and I didn't know what he was talking about. I absolutely did not know what he was talking about. Now, back in AA then, this fear, the tendency to resent, to react negatively, the thoughts about the banks that I owed, the debts that I owed, the resentments that I had, what certain people had done to me was like it was like a tape that played in my mind. I could hear the words, but the music that I felt was anger and resentment and fear, negative emotions. I lived with something singing a song in me of negative emotions, and I was powerless over this. The simplest thing, I couldn't manage. And one night, shortly after this, a fellow by the name of Tom got up and talked, and he sounded like he had been like me. He'd been around AA for 7 years and had never stayed sober until about 6 months before this. And in our group, he said something that took real nerve. Our group at that time. He said, about 6 months ago, I prayed. He said, I just couldn't go on, and I was dry, but I couldn't go on, and I said a prayer, and he said, the funniest thing happened. And he went on to describe what happened. And I was an atheist sitting in the second row right there, and it didn't make any sense to me. I kind of ducked my head, and I think I was embarrassed for him. Out through my suffering, I was embarrassed for him. Now, the next afternoon, I got to thinking about it, and the third step happened to me. I didn't take it then. It happened to me. It happened out of the total desperation that was still with me dry. I was trapped. I couldn't go back. I couldn't drink. I couldn't go back to that. I'd made my decision. I knew what that would do for me. I couldn't escape back into that. I couldn't go to California to find the answer. I was just fresh back from California with no answers. I didn't have anybody to say, poor Jack, and pull out a checkbook. Now, that's what I really wanted. That would have been the answer. Oh, how sweet that would have been. And how much trouble that would have saved me. How much skin, how much hide that would have saved me. I now know that it would have been the worst thing. That, you see, it would have kept me. It would have postponed, not have kept me from it, but it would have postponed the third step for me. That would have been the power. I knew that if anybody had enough money, they had the answer. If they couldn't, they could find it. It would lead them to where the answer was. I knew it. But in desperation, and what was it that was making me desperate? A very simple little four-letter word. Life. My life. Being alive. Surrounded by my circumstances. And what is it that you are surrounded by today? But your life and your circumstances. And today it seems so simple and so sweet. And most of the things are so easy to cope with. But in that hour, for me, I could cope with nothing. And so in desperation, the third step happened. I prayed the first prayer that I ever prayed in my life to a God that I did not believe existed, and so stated. And I said, I hope you're there. But I can't go on. I knew that by myself I could never make it. I would die sober probably. But I couldn't make it. I couldn't manage. I couldn't think. I could not function. And I prayed that prayer hoping that there was a God and hoping that He could understand English. And I remember that thought, I just hope that all those Germans weren't praying because, with the two languages confusing. That's the way it was. And about 3 days after that was on a Thursday, and on Sunday something happened. And that something happened was that prayer was answered. In a very direct and personal way, and in just a split second, I didn't believe that there was a God. I knew there was one. I knew it. I won't try to convince you of it, but I haven't spent a minute since then not knowing it. I knew as the result of that third step that I was forced into taking, and as far as I know, until that hour, I had never read these steps or this book or any of the literature. I was going to the meetings and not taking a drink. And then that step, and some things started happening to me. And that was the beginning of the most exciting experience of living that I know how to talk about. On that Sunday, I started knowing that it is possible to be different. If it was possible to get the way that I was, and I got that way, then it was possible to do something about it. It was possible to find real answers, but not by myself. I knew that there was an intelligence and a power, and that this is what the program was about. I knew it before I even read the book, and I read the book, and all it did was to confirm what I knew. And that started for me a period of real activity. Not too long after that, I took the first fourth step, and I took that because I was suffering. The other day, the last meeting that I attended in my group before I left on this trip, a fellow that's been in our group about 7 months, and our group has been taking its fourth step the second time this year. And this fairly new member had just finished his fourth and fifth steps. And after the meeting, before I was leaving, he said, I've got to talk to you. And I could tell he was a little disturbed, and he wanted to go into another room. And so we went into another room, and he said, I'm very concerned. And I said, well, what is it, Bob? And he said, well, I just took my fourth step, and I just took my fifth step. And he said, I think I'm being very dishonest about it. And I said, well, tell me about it. And he said, well, the only reason I took it was because I wanted to stop hurting. And I listened for the rest of it, you know. And he said, that's so dishonest, isn't it? And I said, that's the most honest reason I've ever heard of in my life. That's the only reason. The only reason that I know of to take the fourth step is to stop hurting. Now, if I'm not hurting so much, I can take the fourth step so I won't hurt next week. You know, a little pre-medication, as far as that fourth step is concerned, won't hurt anything, because it is a release and a relief. So, right after that third step that happened to me, I took the fourth deliberately and consciously and as searchingly and as fearlessly as I could. And some of the most surprising things started to be revealed to me. I really did start to see the nature of my sickness, of my dis-ease. I knew that I had been, and I knew that I had been afraid. But I'd been unable until that moment to see why or how, or to, in any large measure, to be separated from it. And I brought over into my sobriety that sense of impending doom and a continuing fear. I don't believe that there's anybody here that can tell me anything about fear that I don't know. Maybe you can. I don't believe you can be more afraid longer than I was and not lose your mind. I've awakened many nights in my life screaming, afraid, and of no known thing, just afraid. And I still had that fear. I took that step, and the fifth and the sixth, and do you know that fear left me? And the night before my fifth AA birthday, I awakened in the night very much afraid. And I was so glad because I just looked at it and it went away. But it reminded me, once again I saw something else that I had to be grateful for. The relief and the release from the fear. Now, about the time I took that step and the fifth, and I took it with someone, the man I chose to take my step with, I was ashamed really to take that first one with somebody, and I chose a Baptist minister in a strange town whose voice I had heard on a radio. And he sounded real good on the radio, and I like Baptist ministers real good, and we're going to have one down here this weekend who's going to talk to us. But don't ever select the one I did to take your fifth step with. Because he didn't know why I was there. And after about 2 minutes, I didn't know why I was there, and I would have given $29.86 to have been away from there. That was all I had. I'd have given more if I'd have had more. But it was a good experience for me. I went on and took that same fifth step with another person, and I learned a lot. You know, we learn both ways, and I learned a lot from that. And at this time in my life, I saw something that, we hear in AA that there are no musts, but there are lots of you betters. And I started seeing some of the you betters for me. And it's an amazing thing how that we'll see something and pick up this book, and there it is. You know, what we just saw, there it is. Didn't see it before, but there it is. Or someone will walk in and start telling us just what we just discovered about ourselves. And one of the things that I saw was that resentments, anger, had to go. And you say, well, you've known this all the time. Well, I didn't know it all the time. I didn't know. I thought that a real man was supposed to feel that way. And I had been a real man. Had worked on it. I'd spent hours thinking about the perfect crime. And there was one old boy that I did not want to die. I wanted to kill him. I didn't want him to get dead before I got to him. And you think I'm kidding. But I'll guarantee you he was in danger 24 hours a day. He didn't really know it, but he was. I had his number down pat, and I was just waiting. And when I saw that my resentments had to go, that no one had ever really done anything to me that I had not given them permission to do, I had put myself where I was. Had I not been who and what I was, and had I not had the attitudes that I had, none of those experiences could have happened to me. Therefore, those people were not responsible. I had to take the burden off of those people and put it on myself, and I didn't want to do it. Too nice the other way, too soft. Takes off too much skin, but I had to do it, and not for them, but I had to do it for me. And I saw that I had to not just give up resenting that one, and then take that same resentment and, just kind of set it aside until it picked out somebody else. Because it would. Any more than I could stop drinking bourbon and switch to vodka. For a long time I tried to shuffle it around and find a different combination. I tried to not be powerless over bourbon. Or I gave up bourbon and tried to work it out with vodka. But I saw that I had to become willing to stop resenting everybody, anybody, at any place and at any time for any reason. That I had to put resentments and anger in the same category with one drink. I could not afford it. I could not afford it because if I continued to resent, I lost me. I could lose in 2 minutes a state of mind that it took me days to acquire. I could lose in 15 seconds the feeling that I had in that meeting the night before. I could lose everything that I'd spent hours seeking to pray for as far as my consciousness was concerned, and that these resentments had to go. And that I saw and read that I had to start with old Garnet. He was the one at the top of the list. And so I started praying for Garnet. I had gotten into the habit of praying because a funny thing happened. It worked. I found out that I could change things on the other side of town by how I thought and prayed before I left the house in the morning. Now, if you don't believe that this was a new way of thinking for me, well, please believe it, because I didn't think like that before. I didn't believe like that. I wasn't involved with anybody that did. But I discovered through this program that if I changed my attitudes, if I arranged my thinking within me in a certain way over on my side of town, that things worked out differently, better on the other side. I found out that on those days when I could do this better, that I always seemed to be at the right place at the right time instead of at the wrong place. The timing just reversed itself as far as my experience was concerned. And I saw that these principles were things that a person can prove to themselves. You see, I was the kind of guy, I couldn't believe in this program because the book says it or because some old boy got up and said it. I had to prove it to myself, point by point. And I proved these steps. And I proved the presence of God and the power and the love of God. And I proved that there was a power that was a substitute for my inadequacy and for my insanity. But anyhow, to get back to old Garnet, one day I started praying for him, and I forgave him for all those things he had done to me. Then found out that he really hadn't done so much. It had really been my fault. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, I think, to really pray for that fella. And I kind of thought, well, like this. Well, God must have loved Hitler. Yes, He does. He did. Well, but surely not Garnet, you know. It took me a while to get Garnet in there, but I finally got him. And a few days after that, I was riding along, and the new automobiles had just come out, and I was riding along on a 4-lane road. And I was going pretty slow, and it was a beautiful autumn day. Just beautiful, and I was feeling so good, real good. And a new Chevrolet was passing me, going about 5 or 10 miles an hour faster than I was driving. I looked over, and it was the first Chevrolet I had seen of that model. And you know how we look at new cars, and I was looking at it. I thought, gee, that's a pretty car. Guess who was driving it? Garnet. And do you know, when I saw it was Garnet, I was glad that Garnet had that car. Now, I didn't have to think about it. Suddenly, instead of hating him. Before, I would have wanted to run him right into the ditch. You know? The son of a gun. But at that moment, I really cried. The tears ran down my cheeks because I proved to myself once again that this power works. I didn't have the ability to control my emotions, my resentments. But I had prayed about this and had turned it over to God. And Garnet wasn't the beneficiary of this. It was I that had the release and the relief. And a short time after this, I made a list of all of those persons that I had harmed. And he was the first one on the list. And I went to him. And it never occurred to me that we were ever going to be big buddies. And we never were. But I went to him and told him how sorry I was for the things I had done to him that were wrong. And I meant it. And a few years after that, I had not seen this man for many years. And one day I was driving by a store that he had bought and was operating. And I stopped in that store, you know, just to once again, I didn't make my amends to him again, but I walked in and bought something from him and said, "It's nice to see you," and it was, and stood there for a few minutes and left. And the next day he died. And I was so glad I'd been back that second time. My father-in-law was about the second one on the list. And that was a hard one. Because a short time, he and I never had taken to each other. Exactly. And when I got back from California and brought his daughter home and his grandchildren, you know, that he was going to support and I wasn't, this did not make me a hero, I'll assure you. I stayed around there a few days myself. And so things got a little bit too hot. And one day I came in about half drunk. And he had a few words to say. And I said, "Repeat that." And he did. In his living room. He said, "If I had a gun, I'd kill you." And I said, "Wait a minute." And I went out to the car and got my gun and cocked it and handed it to him. Now I said, "Hear this." And he was standing there with my gun in his hand. And if a man ever got cussed in his life, he did. Now, is that insanity? It is. Now, when I had him on my list, and he was quite ill, and I went up, because by this time I was afraid that he might not live until I got there. I had to go make my amends to this man, and there were many others. One of the things that I saw, and I've been working on ever since, and sometimes that I had to give up, was my will in my life. And that's been the hardest thing, to give up my will. To see it. You know, just to see it. What is your will? Show it to me. You know, Where is it? Well, that isn't my will. That's my desire for your good. Huh? I love you so much, darling. It's not my will? The heck it isn't. A long time ago, though, I decided that, that if I was going to have any human being's will in my life, I wanted mine, not yours. This matter of the human will is a source of great suffering for us all. And if you're suffering, there's a pretty good chance that it's coupled to a great big chunk of human will, either yours or some other one that's being imposed upon you. And so that's been a long process of working out for me, and I still need all the help I can get, so, come tell me what I need to know about it. But I've made real progress in the direction of stepping out from under my will and of being willing to have God's will, being willing to be patient to have some larger experience happen to me. And I suppose that the greatest freedom that I've ever known has been to the extent that I've been able to, through these steps, work out of this will. Now, a funny thing happened about this. I meant to tell you about this step of making amends. High on that list was a boss that I had worked for, a fellow by the name of Ray Hess, who had really stuck his neck out for me. I'd had some great potential as a salesman. As a matter of fact, I had an excellent sales record with his company, one of the best records. But they still couldn't put up with me. They still just couldn't go along with the crazy things I did. And this man, in trying to keep me selling for him, just really got clobbered by the home office in Chicago. And I thought of this when I made this list and wanted to make amends. And one day shortly after that, I heard that Ray was in town, staying at Hotel Roanoke. And in order to get up my nerve and see, everything I did, I had to sit down and kind of get ready for it. I didn't just jump right out and do these things because I had to work my way into it. So I stopped by 2AA's house to have some coffee and get up my nerve. And while I was drinking the coffee, I told him what I was going to do. And he said, well, you ought not to do that. And I said, why? And he said, well, the guy probably won't even know what you're talking about, and he'll think you're stupid. And he went on to tell me why not, and she agreed with him. And by the time I got outside now, I really was torn up because I was nervous about it to begin with. But at any rate, with great reluctance, but with a great need, I went over to the hotel and called Ray from the lobby. And when I told him who I was, there was a hesitation. And I asked him if I could come up, and he wasn't sure. But he said, okay, come up. And I went up, and I told him about me, that I was an alcoholic, and I explained alcoholism to him and how wrong I had been and how sorry I was for those things. And we had a wonderful conversation. Now, about 6 months after that, I wasn't doing too well in the job that I had, and I needed another job, and I knew it, and I was ready for another job. I was ready to go back into the work that I had done. And there were no leads. But I did talk to one person, a buyer for a pharmaceutical wholesale house. And then I was just standing around waiting for something to happen. And one day the telephone rang. And it was not Ray Hess, it was another man. But his name is not important. And he said, I understand you're looking for a job. And I told him I was. And he said, come over to the hotel to see me. And I did. And what had happened was that morning, the night before, he'd been sitting in the lobby of a strange hotel. And a fellow came up and sat down beside him. And they read their papers, and then they started talking. And they found out that they were both district managers for pharmaceutical houses. And one said, I've been here for several days looking for someone to take over a territory, and I just haven't found a good prospect at all. Do you happen to know of anyone? And he said, as a matter of fact, I do. There's an old boy here that is one of the best men we ever had. If he's still sober, he was about 6 months ago. He came to me and told me he was an alcoholic, and he was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And if he's sober and if you can get him, he's the best man in this town for you. And he ran me down and found me. Now, had I taken my AA friend's advice and not made that amend. You see how it worked? One day, when I desperately needed another job, two strange men came together in the lobby of the same hotel where I made my amends, and the result was that he found me and gave me the job. Do you believe this program works? Do you believe these principles work? I know it. There have been 1,000, 2,000 times in my life in these years when I have seen dramatic things happen to me and to others as the result of these steps. My experience cannot be the same without these steps as it is with them. And not only that, I can kind of fiddle along and play along and halfway do it, and my experience cannot be what it is if I really believe in them. I believe in these principles, and I believe in the power that is back of them. For one reason, because I've experienced it. On the way down here, after I left home, I was coming through Birmingham. I was looking for an SO service station because I wanted a United States interstate map. And I was about to run out of gas looking for an SO service station, and I thought, well, I better stop at that other one. But I almost didn't stop at that one. I almost went over here, but I went over there. And I got some gas, and I was about to get in my car and drive away. And there was a restaurant down the street away, down the other street, and I happened to look down and see it. And I thought, well, I'm not hungry. I'll go on, and I tried to go, and I couldn't. And I backed up and went over to that restaurant, and I walked in and sat down at the counter, and a voice said, Jack, and I looked around, and there was Bill. Bill said, what are you doing here? And I said, what are you doing here? Now, this same thing happened to us a couple of months before in North Carolina. Now, Bill happens to be a fellow that came into AA about 5 years ago, and he's one of those lovable alcoholics. Everybody likes Bill, except Bill just couldn't stay sober. You know, he just flat didn't want to stay. Well, he wanted to, but he didn't want to become involved. You've seen a lot of Bills. And things got worse. All of those things that couldn't happen to him did, and he had a $35,000 a year job where they needed him, except one day they didn't need him. Now, if you don't think that was a blow, that went, and the home went, and the wife and the kids left Bill, and he'd never been in jail yet, and guess what? And he never had been locked up in one of those everything happened to Bill in those last 5 years. And finally he came to me a while back and he said, I need help. Will you help me? And I said, not unless you're willing to do what I do. You've never been willing to do what the program says. If you want to do exactly what I do, what I have to do, then I'll help you do that. He said, I'll do anything. And we very quickly sat down and got down to this fourth step. And I said, now, before I say yes, let me tell you what this involves. And I explained the fourth step to him. And I said, now, if you want to take that fourth step and that fifth one, because I don't believe you're going to stay sober till you do. I don't believe you're going to find it till you do. And I said, you haven't found it. Now let's do it this way and see what happens. And he said, okay, and he did. And he took one back then, but it was a kind of a piddling one. You know how that first one sometimes is. But that was all right because he took one and he was staying sober. And a month ago, over the weekend in Roanoke at the state convention, we really did get with it, and we took a good one. And it was this same Bill that I bumped to in Birmingham. And he was sitting there and his face was all lit up. And we had the most wonderful conversation. And we stepped outside together and he had tears running down his face. You know, he said, I want to thank you. And I said, what for? He said, for making me take that fourth step. He said, ever since I took it, he said, from that Sunday when I took the fifth step with you, he said, I've had the strangest experience. He said, I like being where I am. Now you think about that for a minute. He said, all my life I hated being where I was. He said, I've been trying to be somewhere else. And he said, I like being in Birmingham. He said, the other day in Atlanta, he said, I just looked up and I just loved Atlanta. I like being there. And he said, I've started liking me. And I said, you know that you've probably have just touched on one of the great symptoms of alcoholism. I've never known an alcoholic yet who liked being where they were. We can't stand it until something happens. And these steps, this way of life is how to make that something continue to happen for me. And the 11th step of continuing through prayer and meditation, continuing to remember. In this book, Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a great deal that is said and implied about practicing the presence of God. And probably the 5 most important words that I've ever heard in my life are practice the presence of God. To remember to do it. To remember it as I go into a situation. To remember it just riding down the road in my automobile. That's to me what the 11th step is. Continued. Through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact with God. To improve my conscious contact with God. Where else in your life have you been promised? Maybe you have, but I was never promised and assured that it was possible to have a conscious contact with God. Now, I don't mean some intellectual concept. I don't mean some pretty words that we can use to try to convince each other that some power exists. But I mean a conscious contact with God. There's a power that created this universe and all that's in it. Must be very intelligent. It is. Must be very powerful, and it is. But I didn't know until AA that it was possible for me to develop a conscious contact today. Not in some future time or some future life or experience, but right today. And that these steps are really the tools to eliminate from my thinking and from my life and from my experience all of the things that keep me from experiencing that conscious contact. That's why they're so necessary, is that there's so much that stands between me and what I would experience. There's so much that stands between me and the light, and that is me. You know, it is I that stood in the way. How to get me out of the way and how to keep me out of the way. And how to remember that there is something that is more powerful than whatever situation that I'm experiencing. Whatever problem that I have. There's something larger than this. That can and will and does bring about a miracle, which is a very natural experience in Alcoholics Anonymous. We see them all the time. But can I remember this as well today as I did in those early days when I had to work every day to have a miracle take place across town? I need it as badly now, and I'm sure you do too, as I did then. And this is what this way of life is all about for me. It's how to have that experience. It's how to not live on my own adequacy because I don't have any. It's not how to live on my own intelligence because my intelligence is what got me there. I don't want to use the same thing to recover with that that I used to get there with. And I don't have to. There is a power and there's a way. There's an answer. A total answer to no matter what's wrong. There's a better way. There's another day. There's a higher experience. And that's why we're here this weekend. You know, we're not just down here to hear people talk. We're going to hear some wonderful talks after tonight. But we're here to have a continuation of this awakening. Who in this room tonight is satisfied, totally satisfied with your life's experience? Which one of you has arrived? I was reading in the newspaper the other day about the Dallas Cowboys, and we like them pretty good. We prayed about them tonight at supper. Bob White did, I didn't. But I was reading in the newspaper where the coach said that it was talking about their weakness as far as pass defense. And he was talking about what they were doing to improve it and how the fellows were coming on. And he said, if an athlete does not continue to improve himself, he's finished. And I'll say to you that if an alcoholic doesn't continue to improve himself, he's finished. You believe it? Those athletes are not going to lay down and die or get drunk if they don't improve. They just don't play with the Dallas Cowboys. But we're talking about something that's bigger than a game this weekend. We're talking about a real game of life and how to play it. And that it can be fun. I didn't know that living was fun until I came in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I guarantee you it is. It's fun. It's fun to be alive. It's good to be alive, and I didn't know it. But unless I had people like you, I probably would not remember it. And I would go back to remembering other things. Today, many times today, I've stood out, looked at this lake, and I've been with many of you and have talked. And I've been so grateful just for the joy of being. We're miracles. If you find yourself thinking about some little old nitpicking something, you know what Joe said at the meeting the other night. And the boss doesn't appreciate the wonderful job you're doing. And that woman that you have to live with. Stop and remember that what a miracle it is that we're alive. And that this is really just the beginning of the game for us. We haven't gotten to the end yet. That it's an unfolding process, that the greatest part of it lies ahead, or can, if I will let it, if I'll get myself out of the way. That this is not the end of our experience, but it's the beginning. And weekends like this are where we gather together to be reminded of this. To remember, to know, to feel, to understand a little bit more, and to get a little bit more of me out of the way so that my life can be different. See, this program taught me a very painful thing. Very hard. It said, Jack, the only thing you can change is you. Isn't that hell? Because I've been trying to change everything else. But all that I can change is me. But it says, that's enough. Because you change you, and something out there changes. Work on you. Get yourself out of the way. Let go of your old ideas. And we think our old ideas are the ones we had when we were drunk. No, they're the ones we brought down to Lake Whitney with us tonight. Those old ideas that are still there, that still function, that still have the power to determine how I'm going to think and how I'm going to be. It's those old ideas that I need to let go of, and it's people like you that make it possible for me, and it's people like me that talk too much and keep you sitting there when you need to be and want to be somewhere else. But let me just, if I can find it here, I want to tell you something that I read recently that touched me, because it reminds me of me. Here again, it reminds, I need to see me better. I need to see what I am not better so that I can stop being that way. And I need to see what I am better so that I can be that more and more. But in Los Angeles, there's been a study made of a unique friendship between two retarded men. And if you've got about 2 more minutes, let me read this to you. From a shadowy realm where eyes see dimly and mouths mumble and brains black out in the fury of mysterious electrical storms has come an almost incredible story of togetherness. This story is that of Lenny, 28, and Ricky, 33, physically and mentally defective from birth. Human vegetables in psychiatric parlance. They live under constant observation in a ward at Pacific State Hospital in nearby Pomona with 72 others who are retarded. Now, almost invariably, these, the world's unfortunates, are loners. People at this level are always, they have nothing to do with each other. seemingly incapable of knowing that warm human experience called friendship. Yet Lenny and Ricky are all but inseparably friendly. So unique is their bond that scientists are studying them in quest of a better understanding of the elusive emotions that enable humans to enjoy togetherness, even to the point of sharing things they might be expected to reserve for themselves. Ricky is blind. Most of what he knows of the world comes to him through Lenny's eyes. Lenny is almost speechless, except with Ricky, but he communicates to others through Ricky's lips. Lenny is badly crippled, but he can see, and he leads blind Ricky wherever the two want to go on the spacious grounds of the hospital. They share everything. Lenny guards Ricky's tray at mealtime from other patients in the ward, but he is not above stealing food from other patients' trays himself. Lenny gets gifts from his parents and divides them meticulously with Ricky. Ricky, who has no known relatives, does what he can in return. When Lenny is in the throes of epileptic seizures, brainstorms in which he can hurt himself severely unless restrained, Ricky cradles Lenny's head in his arms. Each has an IQ in the 30s. It is characteristics of such cases to be loners. Such cases usually are marked by callous indifference. Their relationship is that of billiard balls. They collide and bounce away, unaware of the other's existence. The human relationship known as friendship has never before been observed at this level of retardation. But with Lenny and Ricky it does exist. Therefore it is possible. This highly improbable relationship may help provide a better understanding of that peculiar human quality we call friendship. Each morning they greet one another with broad smiles. Although their conversation is largely unintelligible to others, you know, our conversations are largely unintelligible to others too, aren't they? They talk and joke together with obvious delight. When they sit beside each other on a bench in the sun, their faces and hands become expressive, and Ricky's sightless eyes seem to sparkle and come alive. They've been inseparable since Lenny entered the hospital 10 years ago. Ricky had never shown the slightest interest in other patients until Lenny arrived. And now Lenny frequently says to no one in particular, "I like Ricky." And as bedtime comes each night, Ricky regularly asks his friend, "Did you like this day?" And you people who are here are to me what Ricky is to Lenny, and Lenny is to Ricky. You're my eyes, and you're my speech, and you're my love. And in those hours when I could not hold up my head, you have held it for me, and you've been a comfort and a joy. And through you I've seen beauty when there was none in me. And through you I can say, I really have enjoyed this day.